introduce myself?
No, you go first.
Hi everybody, thank you very much for coming to our best practice for reporters for using live videos. I just introduce ourselves first. I hope this is okay. I'm not popping on the microphone. Get your sound right is one of the top tips to start with. My name is Sue Llewellyn and I'm a former BBC producer, reporter, journalist, and so I've done loads and loads and loads of live TV, and therefore, I think this natural move into social media and live broadcasting is a good thing. Oh, I must switch my phone off. Sorry, just always check things first. I have for the last 8 years been doing social media strategy and consulting and trying to help reporters use social media and to change behaviour in newsrooms. And I have worked very closely with this wonderful person next to me.
So my name is Claire Wardle and I basically lead First Draft in the US. We're a non-profit basically looking issues around trust and truth in a digital age. But when we started 2 years ago, we basically had 4 pillars. One was social discovery. How did you find content that was emerging online? Secondly, how did you verify that content? Thirdly, how could you use that content ethically and legally? And the 4th pillar was the misinformation ecosystem, which was the one that we never did anything with. And now that's what everybody wants to talk about. But this workshop I'm excited about because this goes back to my real interests, which is finding this kind of content online and using it ethically. So in a second, we're going to talk about, we've divided the workshop into 3. Firstly, we're both going to talk about the why, when, and how to go live as a reporter yourselves. Secondly, what you need to watch out for when you go live, when you're the reporter holding the phone. But the last section, I'm going to talk a little bit about the use of other people's live videos in your output as journalists. So we're going to cover a couple of things here as a journalist using live video, but also what you need to think about when you're using other people's live video. And I'm going to use the Philando Castile video as a case study. So yeah.
It would be really nice if we could get you to interact occasionally. Don't feel as though you just have to sit and passively consume what we're going to tell you. One of the things to bear in mind is we've got an hour, and there is only a certain amount of stuff we can cover in an hour from normally what would be a training course of a whole day. So it's not going to be a lot of technical information, but it's much more about what you've got to think about and the sort of things that make for best practice. So who has either used Facebook Live or Periscope on Twitter? Who has gone live as an individual, personally? 3 or 4 of you. Okay. And who has done it for work? Slightly more for work, not many. So there's still quite a few of you who've not tried it. And I'm wondering whether that's just because it's very new or because you might be a little bit worried about it, or maybe you wanted to come to this first so that you've got the information you need before you do it. But we're going to start off just by thinking about when you should do it and why you should do it. And one of the things I keep saying to people is just because you can doesn't mean you should. There's so many really diabolical lives out there, absolutely terrible. And if you went to the Facebook Live map or the Periscope map and you clicked on anything there, you're going to see sort of, somebody in his bedroom doing something incredibly boring or perhaps illegal, who knows. So I think you've got to think really carefully about why you want to do this and the whole purpose of doing it. One of the really good things with it is a fantastic way to engage your audiences, and perhaps audiences you wouldn't otherwise be reaching, because obviously you've got a massive distribution system. And it's also really good to get people interacting with you, to sort of engage on a two-way thing. I've always had a bit of an issue being a broadcast journalist, that it's, I'm here, you're there, let me tell you about it. I know better than you. Well, that's not true. I certainly don't know better than you. And this is the whole point of engaging with the audiences. So your lives need to engage people. And we're going to talk a bit more about that later on, about what actually works, what actually engages people. So I think they're sort of sitting there pontificating about something, saying, this is what we're going to do. So less of the broadcasting and more of the intimate chat with somebody. So it might reach different age groups, different demographics. One of the things to think about too is it's an international audience. It is not just your local audience. So There will be language that perhaps you use that people don't understand, or, expressions. So you've got to, don't assume knowledge. This is one of the other things to think about, People don't necessarily know what you're talking about. I think one of the other great things with live, excuse me, I've got a really bad voice, is that it's much more intimate. It's a really good way of kind of revealing yourself to your audiences and getting to know people and showing a bit more of a human side. Absolutely everything we do with social media is about trust. And you have to build that trust with your audience. And if previously you've just been a byline or a correspondent telling them things, then you're not going to have that personal connection with people. And sometimes I think when you first start going live, people go, oh, that's what they're like. Oh, okay, that's fine. But you've also got to be prepared that if you are doing this, or prepare your correspondence, that people may be incredibly personal and their expectations will go up. What is she wearing? Or, God, you look ridiculous. So we're going to talk later about the things you've got to watch out for. But I think, back to the why, audiences love it, or they can love it. They can be extremely critical of it. People comment a lot more on live video than they would do just ordinarily. And perhaps some of these comments are, comments that you don't want to have. So one of the big issues that you need to think about, which we'll talk about later on, is moderation and the difficulty with moderating live stuff. So people also watch these videos for much longer than they would just a normal video. But you've got to have all the key elements in it, and you've got to grab them right up front. If it's not interesting to start with, then nobody's going to stay with you. So you need to build that sense of suspense and engagement and what's going to happen next. I'm sorry, I keep looking to the left. Do come in and sit down. And we've all seen videos, live videos, that have engaged us or have puzzled us, or I'm thinking particularly when they all first started going live, waiting for a watermelon to explode. The sense of jeopardy and suspense and what's going to happen next. These are key elements in a serious broadcast as well. Or one of the really popular periscopes in the UK was people, they just put a phone by a puddle, a giant puddle, and they waited to see what happened next. Could people get over it, around it, through it? And there was all sorts of things. And so more people started watching it, and then they turned up with a surfboard and all sorts of other things like that. So these things might sound really stupid, but at the same time, I think they are elements that we should learn from. I don't think you should be too judgmental in looking at the fun stuff to get across a serious message. You've got to engage people, and part of that, one of the best ways to engage people or to teach people, is to make them laugh. Entertain somebody, and you've got them. So I think many people might have scoffed about the sort of softer side of social media, or emojis and all of those things. I think we can't be too judgmental as journalists. People communicate in different ways now, and if you want to reach the younger audiences, you have to think visually. You have to be doing, and there's a workshop after this, visual storytelling, because this is the way they talk. They either talk in memes or they talk in emojis, and they're continuously talking like this. So you've got to think very visually about your live. So what occasions warrant a live? One of the biggest things to be aware of, obviously, is if you've got a breaking news story, you cannot control what happens next. But people do want to see breaking news. And in the panel we had this morning, Joanna from Twitter made the point that perhaps the best way of telling a breaking news story is not in a live video. Text will get a lot of information across quickly, and obviously Twitter would say that, wouldn't they? But don't forget that we still have all the other tools at our disposal. So don't just think you should switch this on and then start recording something, because you could find yourself in deep trouble if you're just doing breaking news and it's unpredictable. So the kind of things that work really well, obviously, would be behind the scenes, exclusive access to something, showing people something they couldn't get anywhere else. And I've always said don't underestimate how excited people are by figuring out how TV works, the behind the scenes of that, or the access that you get as a journalist that nobody else would have. So it's taking them with you on a journey and showing them something behind the scenes. Joanna also made a really good point. It's not this that we want to see when we're live broadcasting all the time. It's much more, come with me. It's the you're my friend and I'm taking you on this journey, much more intimate, not I'm telling you, because again, that's broadcasting. And obviously there is a place for talking straight at the camera and reading the things, but again, don't be afraid to turn your back as though you would be taking a friend on a journey. The other sorts of things would be if you've a TV program, you can continue the program off air, you can get comments in from people and keep pointing up, more places to go, more bits of discussion. You could have events, you could have demonstrations. I mean, the world is your oyster with what you do, but one of the things that people have to think really carefully about is how you're going to plan it. So we'll come into the sort of how you do it in a sec. But it's also, do you want it to be informal, or do you want it to be like a TV program? Sometimes when you watch lives, and it is just like a really boring studio discussion, with people sitting in chairs in their sitting room type of thing, and it's just deadly dull, and that is not going to engage your audiences. And one of the things you've got to watch out for when you do that is that you don't bore them, because they won't stick around with you. So if you want to make it look professional, have you got the resources to do that? Have you got a producer who can moderate, take the comments in on WhatsApp and then relay them to the presenter? Have you got a director who can sort out the camera angles and things? You can do it in multiple mobiles. So it is much more resource heavy and it's much more intensive. So many people haven't got the facilities for that. So if it's just going to be you, how are you going to do it? How are you going to control all the comments that come in? And are you safe? There's lots to look at there. So before you hit the live button, the things that you ought to be thinking about is, as a TV producer who would be making live show, I did a 3.25 hour live show every single day. You have to sit down and you've got to think, what's the story? What do I want to get out of this? Who are we going to be talking to? We knew exactly the location we were coming from. We'd done a recce. We'd done a risk assessment to say, is this a safe place to be broadcasting from? Have we got permission to be filming here? What's going to happen in the background? What does it look like? Who are we talking to? Can they actually sustain a conversation? Get your guests all sorted out. And part of our jobs was obviously writing a proper brief with all the questions that the presenters could ask. And this is the angle the conversation could go off at. So think really, really carefully about exactly what you want to get out of this and what your audience fundamentally is going to get out of this. Audiences first before you think of anything. It's when we were doing social media training, we would always talk about finding somebody's Wi-Fi point, the what's in it for you. What are you going to get out of this as the watcher of the live stream? Or it's not what I want to tell you, it's what the audience wants or needs to hear from you. So trying to work that out and work backwards. Thinking about the location again, what about lighting? I mean, sometimes you see some truly appalling live videos where the lighting is just awful or it's far too dark. How are you going to cope with that? When the sort of practicing of doing the presenters, they've got to start off by sustaining the conversation. They've got to keep people with them and have something to say and explain what they're going to do. I'm really sorry about my voice. Oh, it's so awful. Sorry.
And also, Sue was not in the bar until 4 a.m. She actually went to bed early. I just want to say that.
We'll be in the bar till 4 a.m. tonight, but I wasn't last night. But it was the talking all day yesterday. It's just done me in. Yeah, so sorry about that. Grabbing people. You've got to make sure that the presenter who's doing it is just engaging and smiling. For goodness sake, smile. You can always, you'll hear somebody's voice if they're smiling. I've always said, if you're doing a radio interview, stand up and smile and walk around because there's much more energy in your voice. And if you're smiling, you sound much more engaging. So I think smile at the camera, be engaging with people, welcome them, trying to explain what you're doing, why you're doing it, and while the people are joining in from the live thing, then you've just got to sustain that discussion for as long as you can. Introduce people, explain where you are, discuss the location, all the small details that might sound incredibly boring, but it's just a way of getting people to come with you on your journey. The other thing to bear in mind, and as producing live programs. What's the worst thing that could happen, and what are you going to do about it? Imagine a worst-case scenario and have a crisis plan for if that happens. So, if your guest dries up on air, God, who hasn't had one of those? If somebody decides they want to come behind the camera and start fooling about, and we've all had those too. There's always a loony on the scene who might disrupt things. More important, actually, perhaps not more important, but absolutely critical is, have you got enough battery on your phone? Have you switched your phone to airplane mode so all your notifications aren't going to keep disturbing people? Have you got the right microphone? The sound is critical when you're doing these kind of things. So make sure that you've got all the right technical stuff before you even begin to think about doing any of these things. Also, when you are doing it, a bit like telling any story, a beginning, middle, and an end, how are you going to end it? What are you going to do when you get to the end to tell people to wrap it all up? How are you going to send them off somewhere for more information? What do you want them to do at the end of the broadcast? And bear in mind that most people will come to the live video when it's not live, on Facebook. 60%, I think, come when it's already uploaded, so it's not live at the time. So make sure that all of that makes sense. The sort of stuff that would make for a good live is something new, obviously, and something important, something relevant to your audience, something visual, something good to look at. If you're just sitting there and you're a couple of talking heads, that's not that exciting, but is there something really good, whether it's in the background or it's happening, it's not too distracting, or you've got something that you could show and tell? Those things work well. One of the most important things, though, is that sense of suspense or surprise. What's going to happen next? You've all seen the wonderful Chewbacca Mum Facebook video with the woman putting the mask on and laughing herself stupid. I showed that to a group of Kenyan journalists last week when I was talking about Facebook Live with them. And initially it was like, what on earth is she doing showing us this video? It's just crazy. But it has all the right elements for a successful live. It's got that sense of suspense. You're thinking, what on earth is she doing sitting in the car? Where's this going? So you've already hooked them in with this. Why is she so excited about this thing that she's bought? What on earth is going to happen next? It's got the absolutely critical ingredients for making a successful live. And also, it makes you wet yourself laughing. Or perhaps not all of you don't look that impressed. I thought it was hilarious, and I still find it hilarious. And actually, they went with me and thought it was hilarious. But I thought it was a good learning point because it had all the right things that you need to be thinking about. You can't expect to make your audience laugh themselves stupid every time you do a live. And indeed, that's absolutely not the point of it. But suspense and surprise are two of the key elements in making a successful one. The other thing I bang on about all the time, because my background is psychology, is you have to make people feel something. If they don't feel something when they look at your output or they look at your social media updates, whether that's, oh, I didn't know that, or, wow, that's brilliant. Some kind of emotional response is incredibly important. And basically, I think you failed if you haven't generated an emotional response in people. They need to feel part of the conversation. They need to feel as though you care what they're saying to them. They need to feel as though they trust you. They need to feel inspired or enthused or informed or engaged or entertained or something. They need to be liking, commenting, and sharing your stuff. This is absolutely critical. You've got to keep saying to them, talk to me, send me your thoughts, send me your comments, and take them on a journey with you. I think if you haven't emotionally engaged your audience, then you need to go and get some lessons on how to do that, basic human psychology. Be relaxed. Talk to the camera. There's no bloody rush to get these things over and done with, but you need to think before you've started. How long are you going to go on for? And you're probably thinking the same thing about me. How long is this woman going to jabber on at me for? But you've got to work out how long is too long. So many of the things I've looked at are just dull and they're wasting time. So have a plan when you're going to do it of how long we can sustain this for. And, if it's 5 minutes, that's great. If sometimes, I think the BBC one the other day with the Westminster Bridge thing, that went on, I think it was 3 hours, because that was really interesting. There was lots to talk about. The one thing I've already said, don't imagine that people know what you're talking about. Don't assume knowledge. So explain. And I don't think it's a question of dumbing down for things, but an explainer to explain what's going on will bring in, it's much more inclusive than if you start using language that perhaps people don't understand. So don't be stiff and boring, and don't assume that they know too much, or too much about the topic. The other thing is, if you are doing this, is don't keep swinging around and just, people will feel sick. All that trying to do this sort of trendy camera angle stuff, and I listen to my dad who'd be watching it just going, keep the camera steady, because otherwise you're going to make people feel very seasick. So do come and sit down. So I said before, smile at people, welcome them in, engage with them, and we'll open this to questions later on to be more specific, but I just wanted to come up with a few general things of what you need to think about, the positive, do this, and do this. And then also we've got the next section would be the what you shouldn't do. And I don't know if anybody was at the session this morning that we ran. But I did mention what I'm going to talk about now. I think this quote from Mark Zuckerberg, you can't possibly plan for something that's live because you never know what's going to happen. However, I do think there are many things you should be doing to mitigate against potential things that could go wrong. But he says somewhat counterintuitively, a great medium for sharing raw and visceral content. And I think if we switch to some of the raw and visceral content that you would have seen, many of the lives that we hear about are absolutely horrifying. And obviously, as lovely respected journalists, you wouldn't do anything remotely like this, but they do end up being news stories that we cover. And Claire will talk about some of the ethics of embedding live video, or how, certainly with the case with the Fernando Castile, we've heard a lot about these kind of things. So I'm not going to talk specifically about the disastrous things that could go wrong, because we'll have a case study for that, but it is something that we need to think about. So I came up with an acronym to make it easier to remember some of the things that you've got to consider that could go wrong before you start pressing the live button. And the first one, well, I'll start off like this. Obviously, any excuse to get a bit of James Bond in there. It's called SPECTRE, is the acronym, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with Daniel Craig, more's the pity. But so if you just think, a spectre is something to be wary of. It's something scary, it's a force for evil, possibly. So before you go live, think, oh, something scary, what could go wrong? So the S for spectre is all about safety and security. And I just see if this plays. You probably won't be able to hear it. It's not so much the sound, but it's just, this is a fashion blogger who has a big audience on Periscope. And she keeps, every day she tells people what she's doing.
Periscope, so just really excited to be nominated and to meet all the other bloggers at the event on Saturday. Was Al telling everyone to keep the videos clean? I did get one really rude snap yesterday.
Whoopsie. That's the problem. Safety is one of the...
She got mugged. I thought she'd fallen down a pothole, but she got mugged.
Yeah. Because she's not looking where she's going. She's not looking at who's around, who's thinking, oh, there's a nice phone, I'll have that. The first thing you need to think about before you do any of this is the safety of the person doing it, and the safety of everybody else around you, and security. So it's not just in terms of somebody stealing the phone, but it's also in terms of location. So we've had certainly I think it was in Norway, police warning parents about their kids going live. Switch off your location if you don't want to appear on the global map when you're going live. For many people, you obviously do want to say, well, hey, look at me, I'm in Perugia, this is amazing. But just think really seriously about the safety of the location. And I know I go on about this all the time to journalists I'm training, because many of them have got location switched on for things. And I've certainly found, senior correspondents giving their location away in Syria or wherever they are. It's just be super careful with the location settings on your phone. So if you want people to find your stream in the grand scheme of things in the world maps, that's fine, switch it on. But otherwise, switch it off. Be aware of that. But I think in the where you're going to do your lives, think about what's around you. What can you see? We were talking this morning, Ben from Channel 4 was talking about how they were doing a live in Parliament, well, just outside Parliament. And it's just like anything else with a camera. People go, oh, I'm going to be on television. So it looked like there was a massive demonstration, and suddenly there were behind them, you know, people doing demonstration. So you have to be aware of all of the safety and security. So I think the other thing is if you are doing it and it's got celebrities in it, or it's got any people whose security might be compromised, maybe it is a good thing to switch your location off because you don't want somebody coming along. Same thing with children. Just be incredibly aware of what safety is. So I know, go on and on about that. The next one is, so that's the S of Spectre. P is for privacy and also permission. Everyone has a right to privacy and a right to a private life. And I think one of the issues that was raised in the thing this morning is we are now all finding ourselves filmed, obviously, oh God, filmed wherever we go, and our privacy is being invaded. If you are doing a live, you must ask people if they're okay to appear on this. You can't go around getting disclaimers signed all the time from everybody like you would do if you were making a TV program, getting release forms or a movie signed. But it's incredibly important that you say, you know, we are going live. Are you comfortable with that? And have we got your permission? So I think consent, you can't go around and get it after the event. It's too late. But the other thing I do think we have a duty of care is to warn people about, this is a general thing in social media, is how far all of this travels, how very public it can be, and certainly in breaking news situations, if you wanted more of that, Claire can say the impact it's had on people from sharing a video online, and that's not even going live necessarily, but it can have a life-changing effect on somebody. So privacy and permission are really important if you are going to go live. So that's the P. Ethics. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think this is an example from a German reporter who was in Nice, who could well have decided to start periscoping or Facebook Live, periscoping the Nice lorry going ahead. And you can read it for yourselves. What he's saying, but he decided not to do it live for all the right reasons, because it could have been incredibly traumatic. It could have been invading the privacy and the rights of the people who've been injured. It was so unpredictable, you just don't know what's going to happen. And as he says too, he was shocked. You can't make a reasonable judgment when you yourself own a rights date. So this is the other thing to bear in mind, is the emotional impact of a news story, breaking news. So I'm going to have another swig of water. So I think that, if you're talking about best practice, think about him. He certainly went around gathering the material that you could use afterwards. You don't have to be first. You've got to be right, and you've got to be able to sleep at night, and so is everybody else. So make sure that you make the right choices, even though you think, I could be filming this live. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be live. So that's the E. Copyright. Copyright mostly would be relating to music. If you're filming, you're not supposed to be filming at a gig necessarily, but there could just be music in the background somewhere. Have you got the right to broadcast? No will be the answer. Or games. Maybe you're at a football match or something. Obviously not necessarily going to do that as a journalist, but you might be reporting on something with games in the background that have got broadcast rights. So you've always got to think of the copyright of whatever else you've got, whether it's music or games, or indeed if you've got other people's material, photographs or whatever. As a general principle, you have to say, did you take it and maybe use it if you want to use somebody's picture? You've got to make sure that you've got the permission of the copyright owner if you were going to use it. But mainly, in my case for the Spectre, copyright would relate mainly to music and to games. So, that's the C. This is the one. You will be abused online, full stop. The trolls will turn up, full stop. If you're a woman or a person, a minority, you will be abused. And so will your guest. Absolutely. It's not just the what is she wearing type of thing, but it could well be, God, fat, or, some absolutely awfulness. We have a duty of care to protect the people that we are, doing the lives with, warn them of what to expect. Also, explain to them, what they should be wearing. If we were going to be doing a live with somebody on TV, we'd say, don't wear stripes, and, we can see your legs, so make sure you've got proper shoes on, or not your old flip-flops or whatever. Think how you're sitting. So we would tell people what to expect if they were going on telly. The same thing if you were going to be doing a live with them. Think about, don't sit there looking at the camera like a scared rabbit in the headlights. Explain to somebody how they can relax in front of the camera. Explain to them how far this kind of information can travel and the impact that might have, that their name will suddenly become popular. They might get abuse on social media. There are many, many considerations, so we have a duty of care to our guests as well as to the presenters themselves. But be aware, there will be trolls and you will get abuse. So how are you going to deal with it? Are you going to do any kind of blocking comments altogether? Or is there some way that you can somehow moderate the comments? Mark Frankel, social media editor for News, he said it was really interesting looking at some of the comments that come in on Facebook Lives, because you can see if people are enjoying it, there's loads of smiley faces and stuff. They might be putting smiley faces on inappropriate content, smiling at something that's actually not smiley. But you can usually tell when things are going downhill and people are losing interest because the angry faces turn up. So if you suddenly see the emojis, the reactions are all changing, then you might be losing your audience and perhaps it's time to wind it up a bit. So trolls, do think very carefully and have a strategy for dealing with moderating comments. And this isn't the place to sit and have a massively long discussion about how you do that, but it is incredibly important to warn people about how you're going to do it. The other thing, actually, while I'm on a T as well, T would also be trust in the spectre. You've got that trust that you need to build with the audience. So I think, how are you going to do that? And so if you mess up, fess up. Own up is the most important thing. If you've made a mistake on something, and own it and say, I'm really sorry, I got that wrong. Here's the right information or whatever. There is evidence that if you have got something wrong and you've screwed up, people actually trust you more if you've owned up. So, we can all make mistakes, so don't feel terrible about saying, oh God, I'm sorry I got that wrong, because we'll go, oh, okay, I trust you. You've owned up to it. But if you try and hide it, you're screwed. So that's the T for spectre. Sorry about the picture. Reputational risk is a massive thing if you're going to be going live. At best, you can bore the pants off your viewers. Sorry, I've got to stop waving my arms around. So the best thing that could happen is that you would bore somebody. Well, that's not a good thing at all. You don't want to be boring people because they'll never come back. The worst thing that could happen, it could be defamation. You could end up in court. Something absolutely appalling might be said about somebody, They may well go off on one about paedophiles, or, you've got to be incredibly careful about what people might say. So reputational risk is a massive issue. Part of that will then come with knowing who you're talking to and, briefing them all properly. But be aware that something really bad could happen and how you can prevent that. I'm just trying to think of things that have gone wrong in the past. But perhaps it's not worth, as it's being recorded, it's probably not worth mentioning some of those. This next one is a really big one. Emotional trauma. These are comments from some research that Claire and her colleagues had done about the impact, vicarious trauma, on looking at material on social media. So this is actually from the Bangkok bomb and the comments that came through from some of the people who were watching it. The point being, though, is on a breaking news situation in a bomb, you don't know what you're going to see. And as a journalist in the newsroom, I have seen these pictures, and believe me, you don't want to see them because you never unsee them. And part of the thing there is, if you're unprepared, it's going to be far more psychologically damaging than if you think, right, I might see something bad. So it's perfectly okay to issue a health warning to say, we might be covering some sensitive content in this broadcast, or some viewers might find it offensive or whatever. But this is one of the things why that guy in Nice made the right choice, because there were some horrific pictures. So he made absolutely the right choice. So think carefully about the impact that what you're showing might have on the person viewing it at home. You know, there's no watershed when you're doing live broadcasting, and you don't know if it's kids watching it from their bedrooms at home. And what you might find acceptable, somebody else might find totally unacceptable. But think of the emotional impact what you're showing to people might have on them, and prepare them for it, or just cut it. You know, don't do that at all. So that's the things to think about. Before you press the live button, you've got to think, Daniel Craig. No, not Daniel Craig. You've got to think of Spectre, and then go through the... I don't even like Daniel Craig. But, yeah, think through the letters, and just as a little reminder, I always think it's helpful having an acronym, because I can't remember anything, so I keep going, S-B-E-C, what do I got to remember? So those are the key points of what you have to think about that could go wrong. And I think now I'll hand over to... Well,
I was just thinking, should we have some questions? And also we have Julian in the audience, who goes live frequently on the streets of Paris, and you actually use live video with audiences to actually talk to them about fact-checking. So I'm sure there are people in the audience who actually do a lot of this. I think it might be worth...
Yeah, come up and join us.
Sharing some examples, or... Yeah, I mean, do you want to come up, Julian, just because of the mic? Oh, there's a microphone. It's just there. Can you put your hand up, Julian?
Yeah, thank you. I should have listened to that speech 6 months ago, because it's been 6 months that I'm doing live every week, and it took me 6 months to actually get to the same conclusions as you, pretty much. Well, I've got so many things to say about that, but one thing that happened to me, and that was a really good experience. I was doing a live on the streets about abortion and the right of women to do abortion, because there's a debate right now in France about it. And he talked about sharing your location. And on one side, of course, if you share your location, it's risky for you, because people could come up and, well, sometimes, you know, beat you up. I thought about that, because sometimes it's sensitive what I'm talking about. But this time, that was amazing, because I was talking about abortion, and I was talking to people on the street about abortion to get their IDs. And at some point, there's a woman that was next to me, like, 3 meters away, and she was listening on her iPhone, I could see. And she was looking at me and listening. And at some point, she came to me and said, well, I was at my place, and I was listening to your live, and I said, well, I have to come talk to you. And she was a nurse, and she had to do abortion on women all the time, and she wanted to talk about it on air. So she actually, went to me. I think it was a 10-minute subway ride, and it's a 45 minutes live I'm doing every week. So she had time to come, and I ended up the show talking to someone that came to me, and that actually was an expert in the topic. And as a journalist, it's something that happened to you. It could never happen before. And that's, I mean, if you don't have Facebook, you don't do Facebook Live, it's an experience you will never have. And honestly, that was one of the best experiences I had in my life, because it's direct interaction, not only to the audience, but she actually came in real life to talk to me. So if you can do that, I think it's, wow.
That's an amazing example.
That's fantastic. Just because of your experience, you said it took you several months to... Don't take it away just yet. Not just yet, sorry, wait a second. Sorry. Just if there was anything else that you would add to stuff that I haven't mentioned, other tips for people, other things you've learned?
I think you mentioned something really important, which is suspense. That's something I'm working on, and it's really hard, because in a live, things have to happen every 5-10 minutes. If you're doing the same thing for 5-10 minutes, unless you have like a horse head on, this woman that was doing something really funny, but otherwise things have to happen. And you're live, so live has to be prepared. You need to prepare things that may happen, and you have to make things happen. That's what if you're filming a protest, and we're just filming the protest and it works, and I don't know, burning tires always work on Facebook, but that's not what I'm doing. You see what I mean? For me, I need to prepare. Yep. And for example, last time I was talking about Apple and the way they don't pay taxes in France. It's a big issue. And I did that in front of an Apple store. And I was talking to people going out of the Apple store saying, well, what do you think? They're not paying taxes, and do you think it's right? They gave me their perspective on it. At some point I said, well, of course it was prepared. And I said, I was with a woman that was an expert in tax evasion, and I said, well, let's get in. The Apple store. Obviously I knew I would be kicked out in a few minutes, but that was suspense, and people were like, oh, and the trend online, I could see like people, woo! I tripled the viewers. Just because I said, come on, let's do it, and they were waiting for me to go. I went in, I carried out the interview inside for 5 minutes. Obviously I got kicked out, but I had time to say, well, Apple never answered to journalists on that, which was perfect because they were kicking me out. And that was the best live I did in the end I had 700,000 people who watched the live.
Wow.
Which is
amazing.
the best live I've ever done. Yeah, I've done much worse, many times. But this one was perfect. Yeah.
And do you think there are topics that you shouldn't be doing live, or that you think work better than others? I was thinking, actually, it's very brave doing a discussion on abortion because it is such a divisive issue that you could have had all sorts of anti-abortion protesters come and cause all kinds of trouble, you know.
I usually like sensitive issues to discuss, and I trust people to. Well, of course, you tell them they're online and live on Facebook, and most of the time you can handle it. So I think we shouldn't be too afraid of talking to people about anything. And of course, if things go bad and the guy is really aggressive or really insulting, then you leave. And I had times, I was on the street and talking to people, and there was like this big black guy, like really big, and he came to me and started, shouting at me, insulting me, and I thought he would actually, beat the shit out of me. And so I had to be cautious, and we're a team. I had 2 other people with me, which actually helps. If you're alone, I wouldn't do that.
Yep. Yeah.
But with a team, it's okay, and I was very polite, and that's life. Any life is like that. You need to take the risk, I think.
Absolutely. You were waving a...
Yeah, I was just, hello, I'm Ezra. I'm having a question, because you said, I knew I was going to be kicked out. So, and there I'm wondering, isn't there a risk as well that because suspense works and effects work, that you start staging journalism? Like you start creating effects because you need every 5 minutes a spike and something that happens, and before you know it, you're storytelling, and storytelling in a bad way, but not in a journalistic way. So it's just a question.
Yeah, of course. In that particular case, I think it was worth it because I had sent many requests for interviews to Apple, and Apple told me that they had no spokesperson in France. We're probably a $1 billion market for them. It's huge, but they don't have anybody to talk about tax evasion in France. They only have people to talk about the new, a new app or new things they're putting on the Apple Store. So I thought that as they didn't want to talk to me, it was fair to actually get in and tell people, well, you don't want to talk to me, then I'm here anyway. And I agree with you. It's a case-per-case decision, and I wouldn't choose suspense over journalistic values, if you want.
I do think it's a really interesting question because we're only kind of a year since Facebook Live launched. And do you remember the New York Times kind of did an editorial meeting? And they kind of live streamed their editorial meeting, and then it became quite clear that it was pretty staged. And there was a huge backlash. And I think you're right, as journalists, we have to think through exploding a watermelon or staging things. It doesn't mean that necessarily we shouldn't be doing them, but we should be much better about flagging what we're doing. It could be, we are recreating an editorial conference for you. But I think we have to be very careful about, because it feels so authentic and because it's called live, doesn't mean that we can't do interesting things with the medium, but I think now we're a year on, we have to be much more sophisticated about how we label this as journalists and how we use it. So, yeah, it's a really good question.
I think you'll do a case study. I just wanted to say the one thing I don't think I've mentioned yet is tell people you're doing it. Yeah. You've got to promote, coming up at such and such a time. Otherwise, they won't know you're doing it. And make sure you've used the right kind of keywords, because that's how you'll get found. If you just say, I'm going to go live. Oh, well, about what? Why should I care? So use the right kind of keywords as well to tell people. But they don't know if you don't tell them, so make sure you've promoted it.
And again, there's a difference there, like Nick Kristof does a kind of a weekly live. I mean, you have a weekly show. Again, when we think about the different types of lives, I think there's something that's kind of the show quality about it, and the regular timing helps audiences know. But I think you discussed this, Julian, but the tensions about having to tease long enough to get the audience to build, but if you're not interesting enough, you're going to lose the audience. Yep. It's a new type of video creation, and I think that's why, as an industry, we should be sharing best practices, because it's a new skill to just keep the audience engaged so that the algorithm can kick in. So yes. So I'm aware of time. So this is kind of a depressing case study around Philando Castile video, but I think I want to use it as an example of how newsrooms should be thinking about this. So when the video played, I think you'll probably agree, but that opening line when she says, "Stay with me," and it's the double meaning of stay with me, please don't die, stay with me as an audience. To me, it's like a Shakespeare play. I mean, it's an incredible 9-minute video. So I wrote a piece I did some research about the video because I really wanted to understand how news organizations had used this particular video. And it's published on the site, but I actually looked at 23 different news outlets, and I looked at all of their online posts, including their own websites, as well as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram on July 7th and 8th of 2016, and found an extraordinary amount of content related to the video. There were, of course, more stories about the case, but these were just stories that included anything from that video that Diamond Metals had published. And it was very interesting to see, I'm not sure how well you can see that slide, but at the far end here you have the New York Daily News, who published an enormous amount of content, over 25 stories on it, compared to Fusion, which of course takes stories around ethnic communities very seriously. They deliberately did very few stories, or they did stories, but they didn't include the visuals. And that difference of the choices made by editors about how to use that video was really the key to the research. So of the 229 stories, 45% used just a screenshot from the video. What do you think was the screenshot? Those of you who've seen the video, what was the dominant screenshot? Yeah. So this was the image that was used again and again. And what was interesting was comparing outlets around the world in terms of what they decided to blur. So in Europe, the fact that you can see blood on Philando's arm there is not something you saw from European outlets. Some European outlets basically blurred the whole of the image. American outlets were much less likely to blur the imagery. But this in itself, even talking to some audiences, I mean, I know you just laughed, Sue, when you did that, but people said as they were scrolling through Twitter to see an image of a gun through a car, yeah, sure. For many people, editors might have said, well, it wasn't graphic, but actually it was pretty shocking. And apologies for this, but I just want to make this point. The New York Times is the only organization of the study that has a policy not to blur imagery. So they actually they chose this screenshot of Philando Castile, basically absolute moment of death. And for me to watch, we'll move on from this, but for me to see broadcasters and print outlets showing moment of death in a way that we would never have previously have done. And I think this question that you're hearing within newsrooms, which is, well, we have to show it because audiences have already seen it. And again, I think that's something as an industry we need to struggle with and question, because now we're seeing more graphic imagery than we've ever seen before. And certainly the so-called torture video from Chicago in January, lots of that was blurred. But we are seeing footage now. We're seeing people committing suicide. We're seeing people being shot while they're going live. That's something that's very different to the things that Sue was talking about, but is similar in the sense of we have a responsibility to decide what we show because of that. And then when we actually looked at how people used parts of the video, many outlets basically took elements from the 9 minutes and created their own videos. 7 of the 23 outlets embedded the official Facebook Live video, some multiple times, and it was clearly a strategic decision for some people to actually show the whole video. And some people said, we can't tell this story without showing you the raw content, whereas other outlets were very much, it's our responsibility not to show you that content. But the last thing is 2 news sites used scraped versions of the video, uploaded illegally by others, who then monetized it on YouTube. and then embedded that YouTube clip into their coverage. So, I mean, in the verification world, scraping is a real issue where content emerges on Instagram, gets copied onto Facebook, gets moved onto Twitter. But in this space, we really shouldn't be using other people's scrapes in our content. We should all know that, but we're still doing it. Secondly, in the US content, it was unbelievable how many outlets were using pre-roll ads in front of the Philando Castile video. So the headline would be, fiancé live streams partner's death, and you click on it, and it was a 30-second advertisement for paint from Home Depot. There's a bigger question here about, as outlets, we're making money off user-generated content, but in terms of this, particularly upsetting. And if you haven't read it, this was a piece that the Washington Post did 2 months afterwards, and they followed up with Diamond Reynolds. Remember, her piece was used, content from her piece was used globally by outlets, many of whom advertised against it, and she was forgotten immediately afterwards. And this was actually going back to talk to her about how she had to close down all of her social media accounts, what the impact was of this story, and the way that it was told through media outlets. And the most upsetting piece for me was, those of you who've seen the video know that her daughter was sitting on the back seat, and the daughter doesn't make a sound as all this happens. And Diamond Reynolds actually explains, these were some of the lessons Diamond had passed along from one generation to the next, and her daughter had learned them well. It's okay, Mummy, I'm right here with you, because she'd basically been told, never touch guns or needles. The more scared you are, the less noise you should make. And for me, this was a reminder of, this was a family that were impacted, that girl was in the back seat, and the amount of coverage we gave that video and what that meant for that girl. And I know some people say, oh, Claire, you're not a journalist if you think like this. But just because we have access to this content, we have to absolutely say, this isn't just like the raw footage we'd get previously. There's much more to that. So just finally, I do think inside your newsrooms, you need to be doing scenario planning around live video. And what I always say to newsrooms is, what would 9/11 look like today? What would you have done as a newsroom? You would have had live streams from people at the top of the towers. We had no idea those towers were going to collapse. What would we have been doing in terms of those live streams? And I would recommend any newsroom has that planning scenario session now, because we know, we've seen enough examples in the last year of the way that live video has played out, and we should know whether we have a policy to actually embed a video. Do we point to a video? Is it okay for the BBC to actually say, we're not going to show the video, but we will link out to somebody else's video? What does it mean when you get a really great live shot from somebody's phone? You can't get access yourself. It's a terrorist incident, but then 15 minutes in, the camera turns around and the guy says, I'm the person who committed this crime. Like in France, the terrorist who basically shot the French police officer and then his partner and the 3-year-old. I mean, we already have some horrific examples. So what's your policy on blurring imagery? What's your policy on graphic warnings? What's your policy on pre-roll ads? How would you choose screen grabs? How do you manage comments in real time? So the other example was the Dallas shootings last summer. A number of Dallas Morning News reporters went live, and talking to the editor there, she said, we were so excited, we had this live technology, we had this big story, reporters went live. What we didn't think through were the comments where people were actually saying, this is the guy who did it, he lives at this address, here's his phone number, in the comments underneath the live streams during the Dallas shooting. So it's not just people giving you abuse in the comments, it's actually defamation, it's actually, stuff that we as journalists have to think through. And live, at the moment, Facebook isn't giving us the technical solutions to turn off emojis or to turn off comments or to make it easier to moderate comments in real time. So I know we just gave you a lot of information in a very short space of time, and some of it was quite depressing. But for me, there's lots that's great about live video, but I feel like we often get the great stuff about live video from Facebook themselves. I think as an industry, we need to think through the other aspects of live video and to think through what we need to do. But does anybody have any last questions in our last 5 minutes?
Very happy to answer them outside, so the next lot can get set up if you like.
Yes, another session.
But thank you. If there's no other questions, thank you very much indeed for coming. And good to see you. Yeah. One of the things to bear in mind is we've got an hour, and there is only a certain amount of stuff we can cover in an hour from normally what would be a training course of a whole day. So it's not going to be a lot of technical information, but it's much more about what you've got to think about and the sort of things that make for best practice. So who has either used Facebook Live or Periscope on Twitter? Who has gone live as an individual, personally? 3 or 4 of you. Okay. And who has done it for work? Slightly more for work, not many. So there's still quite a few of you who've not tried it. And I'm wondering whether that's just because it's very new or because you might be a little bit worried about it. Or maybe you wanted to come to this first so that you've got the information you need before you do it. But we're going to start off just by thinking about when you should do it and why you should do it. And one of the things I keep saying to people is just because you can doesn't mean you should. There's so many really diabolical lives out there, absolutely terrible. And if you went to the Facebook Live map or the Periscope map and you clicked on anything there, you're going to see sort of, somebody in his bedroom doing something incredibly boring or perhaps illegal, who knows. So I think you've got to think really carefully about why you want to do this and the whole purpose of doing it. One of the really good things with it is a fantastic way to engage your audiences, and perhaps audiences you wouldn't otherwise be reaching, because obviously you've got a massive distribution system. And it's also really good to get people interacting with you, to sort of engage on a two-way thing. I've always had a bit of an issue being a broadcast journalist, that it's, I'm here, you're there, let me tell you about it. I know better than you. Well, that's not true. I certainly don't know better than you. And this is the whole point of engaging with the audiences. So your lives need to engage people. And we're going to talk a bit more about that later on, about what actually works, what actually engages people. So I think they're sort of sitting there pontificating about something, saying, this is what we're going to do. So less of the broadcasting and more of the intimate. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to our best practice for reporters for using live videos. I just introduce ourselves first. I hope this is okay. I'm not popping on the microphone. Get your sound right is one of the top tips to start with. My name's Sue Llewellyn, and I'm a former BBC producer, reporter, journalist, and so I've done loads and loads and loads of live TV. Therefore, I think this natural move into social media and live broadcasting is a good thing. Oh, I must switch my phone off. Sorry, just always check things first. I have, for the last 8 years, been doing social media strategy and consulting and trying to help reporters use social media and to change behaviour in newsrooms. And I have worked very closely with this wonderful person next to me.
So my name is Claire Wardle, and I basically lead First Draft in the US. We're a non-profit basically looking issues around trust and truth in a digital age. But when we started 2 years ago, we basically had 4 pillars. One was social discovery. How did you find content that was emerging online? Secondly, how did you verify that content? Thirdly, how could you use that content ethically and legally? And the 4th pillar was the misinformation ecosystem, which was the one that we never did anything with. And now that's what everybody wants to talk about. But this workshop I'm excited about because this goes back to my real interest, which is finding this kind of content online and using it ethically. So in a second, we're going to talk about, we've divided the workshop into 3. Firstly, we're both going to talk about the why, when, and how to go live as a reporter yourselves. Secondly, what you need to watch out for when you go live, when you're the reporter holding the phone. But the last section, I'm going to talk a little bit about the use of other people's live videos in your output as journalists. So we're going to cover a couple of things here as a journalist using live video, but also what you need to think about when you're using other people's live video. And I'm going to use the Philando Castile video as a case study. So yeah. It would be really nice if we could get you to interact occasionally. Don't feel as though you just have to sit and passively consume what we're going to tell you. Then sit down. And we've all seen videos, live videos, that have engaged us or have puzzled us. Or I'm thinking particularly when they all first started going live, waiting for a watermelon to explode. The sense of jeopardy and suspense and what's going to happen next. These are key elements in a serious broadcast as well. Or one of the really popular periscopes in the UK was people, they just put a phone by a puddle, a giant puddle, and they waited to see what happened next. Could people get over it, around it, through it? And there was all sorts of things. And so more people started watching it, and then they turned up with a surfboard and all sorts of other things like that. So these things might sound really stupid, but at the same time, I think they are elements that we should learn from. I don't think you should be too judgmental in looking at the fun stuff to get across a serious message. You've got to engage people, and part of that, one of the best ways to engage people or to teach people is to make them laugh. Entertain somebody, and you've got them. So I think many people might have scoffed about the sort of softer side of social media or emojis and all of those things. I think we can't be too judgmental as journalists. People communicate in different ways now, and if you want to reach the younger audiences, you have to think visually. You have to be doing, and there's a workshop after this, visual storytelling, because this is the way they talk. They either talk in memes or they talk in emojis, and they're continuously talking like this. So you've got to think very visually about your live. So what occasions warrant a live? One of the biggest things to be aware of, obviously, is if you've got a breaking news story, you cannot control what happens next. But people do want to see breaking news. And in the panel we had this morning, Joanna from Twitter made the point that perhaps the best way of telling a breaking news story is not in a live video. Text will get a lot of information across quickly, and obviously Twitter would say that, wouldn't they? But don't forget that we still have all the other tools at our disposal, so to chat with somebody. So it might reach different age groups, different demographics. One of the things to think about too is it's an international audience. It is not just your local audience. So there will be language that perhaps you use that people don't understand, or expressions. So you've got to don't assume knowledge. This is one of the other things to think about. People don't necessarily know what you're talking about. I think one of the other great things with live, excuse me, I've got a really bad voice, is that it's much more intimate. It's a really good way of kind of revealing yourself to your audiences and getting to know people and showing a bit more of a human side. Absolutely everything we do with social media is about trust. And you have to build that trust with your audience. And if previously you've just been a byline or a correspondent telling them things, then you're not going to have that personal connection with people. And sometimes I think when you first start going live, people go, oh, that's what they're like. Oh, okay, then that's fine. But you've also got to be prepared that if you are doing this, or prepare your correspondence, that people may be incredibly personal, and their expectations will go up. What is she wearing? Or, God, you look ridiculous.
So we're going to talk later about the things you've got to watch out for. But I think, back to the why. Audiences love it, or they can love it. They can be extremely critical of it. People comment a lot more on live video than they would do just ordinarily. And perhaps some of these comments are, comments that you don't want to have. So one of the big issues that you need to think about, which we'll talk about later on, is moderation and the difficulty with moderating live stuff. So people also watch these videos for much longer than they would just a normal video. But you've got to have all the key elements in it, and you've got to grab them right up front. If it's not interesting to start with, then nobody's going to stay with you. So you need to build that sense of suspense and engagement and what's going to happen next. I'm sorry, I keep looking to the left. Do come in.